Order, order. Welcome to this morning's evidence session. This is the third session of our inquiry into the government's road safety strategy, and the session is going to focus on speed as a road safety issue. First of all, we're aware that there may be references made to distressing topics or incidents, so please don't mention individual cases where there may be ongoing legal proceedings. We're joined by a panel of 4 today. We did also invite the Road Haulage Association to join us, but unfortunately they pulled out. So could I please ask our panel to introduce themselves, starting with Adrian.
Good morning. Adrian Berendt. I'm a director with 2020 for Us, CIC.
Good morning. I'm Phil Jones. I'm the chair of PJ. We're a transport planning, engineering and environmental consultancy.
Good morning, I'm Lilli Matson. I'm the Chief Safety, Health and Environment Officer for Transport for London.
Good morning, I'm Dr. Rob Török. I'm 14 years of being a pre-hospital critical care doctor with Dorset and Somerset Air Ambulance and 20 years as an emergency medicine consultant.
Welcome. So I'll start off with the first question. The reason the panel are all over there is because we're not sure if the sun's going to start blazing on them over there. So first, to start off, is the primary commitment on speed in the government's road safety strategy, which is to update local guidance on setting speed limits, is it ambitious enough? I'll start with Adrian.
Well, it's certainly very welcome. The guidance on setting local speed limits is well over a decade out of date, and it was based upon data which was even further out of date than that. We think there isn't enough in the road safety strategy about speed. I think there's 37 mentions of the word speed in it, but most of those are about the risks of speed. So it's acknowledged as a risk, but the actual measures are not enough in our view, and we think that it needs to go further. Certainly, the strengthening of the guidance is a way of achieving an effective national policy default, but 2020 has long argued that we should be having a national default of 20 miles an hour on residential streets.
Phil Jones.
Thank you. Yes, I think ideally the model in Wales, which I was involved with, was to set a national default, and that gave a very clear point in time that in which roads would change their speed unless action was taken, and that would be clearly a more ambitious and welcome step. I think in the absence of that, as I agree with Adrian, I think the guidance improved guidance can take us a long way forward. I think at the moment the guidance is really quite regressive. It places far too much emphasis on compliance as the aim of setting speed limits rather than speed reduction and achieving safe speed. So I think the strategy goes quite a long way, but could be much clearer, I think, in setting out what it expects the new guidance to achieve and how those changes, which it's using as its main instrument on speed, how that will be established to make the changes that we're looking for.
Thank you. Again, I would say it's very welcome actually to have a strategy which is discussing this. Again, I would support the calls that it could and should have gone farther in being more consistent about the benefits of reduced speed in civilizing towns and cities in particular, and making them places where people do want to live, walk, cycle, play. We know, so for example, in central London, we made 20 mile an hour the default on the main road network in 2020, and that has very quickly delivered very tangible reductions of around 24% of people being killed and seriously injured, and more importantly, changed the feel of those roads for people who want to use them. So there are real benefits in creating more consistent and broad range measures, and I think that was very much, as we're hearing, a perhaps missed opportunity in the strategy itself, but the guidance could pick up that opportunity, go further and be very clear that actually reducing speed is at the heart of making roads safer. It's the first and most important systemic change that the government and local governments can make.
Thank you. So, not bold enough as far as action and interventions go. What we see at the roadside, the severity of trauma, the numbers killed, there is a massive gap between what's actually happening on the road and the levels of harm and cost and the priority we're giving to actually achieving a reduction. And 20 mile an hour limits nationally set or nationally prioritised urgently would save countless numbers of people from injury and harm and cost. I think one of the key things is, parallel to whatever the government decide on the policy for setting limits and guidance to achieve a widespread increase in reductions in speeds, is a parallel awareness campaign so that the public understand how very small, and policymakers understand how very small changes in average speed have a massive impact on the severity of injuries, the risk of death and the costs. At the moment, we're just out of balance with the real harms and costs and the priority and urgency that is being focused on saving lives.
Okay, thank you. Adrian, in your evidence as 20's plenty for us, you said that you doubt that the proposed measures will deliver the casualty reduction targets. Why is that?
Because there's no commitment to a 20 mile an hour speed limit on residential streets, and since around 50% of KSIs occur on 30 mile an hour roads, without reducing that speed limit down to 20, you simply can't achieve the target of 65%. I mean, it's interesting that we've modelled it, and I think you heard from an earlier witness that the contribution of 20 miles an hour to the government's target is by far and away the biggest single measure that could help. And I think Dan Campbell said something like 10 to 15%, and we would concur with that. But it goes further than that, actually, because not only does 20 mile an hour of itself bring casualties down, it actually enables other measures to come in much more cheaply. And I've seen that in projects I've been involved in, where once you've got the lower speed limit, that enables you, for example, to do an informal crossing rather than a formal crossing. So it makes it all the other measures much easier to implement. And I think it changes the relationship between road users. I think it changes the relationship between the driver and the cyclist, or the cyclist and the pedestrian, so that they look out for each other more. You can just, your field of vision widens when you're doing a lower speed, and so rather than you be surprised that somebody suddenly jumped out in front of you, you've anticipated it. So I think it has a sort of cumulative effect, and it's not instead of all the other measures, it's complementary to that.
Okay, we're going to drill down a bit more into the sort of the mechanics of 20, but Rob.
Thank you. Could I just add in sort of the moral duties part of this? The 20 mile limit and achieving that within urban areas, villages and other roads where vulnerable, innocent, unprotected pedestrians, our children, the frail, cyclists, non-motorised vehicles, horses and horse-drawn vehicles, all those, they are disproportionately within the areas that we would consider 20 mile an hour limit. So the moral obligation and duty to protect those unprotected and to rebalance things away from a focus on motorised vehicles and save our children and the protected, and all a host of other benefits in health as far as active lifestyles, mobility, climate, the sense of security and lack of isolation of people that then allows community involvement, access to health, etc. There's such a raft of other benefits. I'd just like to emphasise that.
Okay, thank you. Scott?
Thank you, Chair. So the Department told us that their strategy is evidence-based, and I think in a lot of the submissions we had, there was some recognition of that. But we had organisations like Brakes that whilst they recognised the evidence-based a lot of the strategy, they thought it wasn't going far enough in terms of looking at what is best practice in terms of speed. So what's the assessment of the evidence-based nature of the strategy when it comes to speed? Do you think there's more evidence out there the Department could be drawing on, perhaps to have a slightly different, more nuanced strategy?
I can't.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we look at some of the evidence that we provided to the government on speed, for example, and just to make sure everyone's aware of it. So we at Transport for London did analyse the impacts of 20-mile-an-hour speed limits across London boroughs over a very long period of time, over about a 10-year period of time. And the results were really unequivocal. So they showed that over that period of time, in terms of the reductions in people being killed or seriously injured, you were achieving around a 34% reduction from the introduction of 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. And that was set against comparator roads, so it was controlled for. For children, that was much greater. That was a 70% reduction. And when you look at the detailed nature of that evidence, and it's absolute, so it's the most comprehensive sort of piece of evidence around 20s across areas. I don't feel that that was pulled through clearly enough to demonstrate the area-wide benefits of 20s and the real need to put that at the heart of a strategy which reduces danger on our roads.
I'm just going to add to that. I mean, I think it's surprising, really, there is no reference to the outcomes of the default 20 mile per hour speed limit in Wales, which is effectively the largest application of 20 miles per hour that we've seen in the UK.
But with Wales, I mean, so in Edinburgh we have a broadly one-third reduction as well because of 20, and that's been subject to peer-reviewed research. I guess the challenge with Wales is it's maybe too soon to work its through the peer-review process.
No, I think it's quite clear that the evidence... We said...
No, in terms of peer review, in terms of independent analysis. So that's going to come back to Lilli. Is the evidence you're talking about, is that TfL's own analysis, or has that been done independently?
So it was done by one of our analytical teams. It was peer-reviewed by academic institutions.
Okay, and you feel that's not been taken on board despite the real results there, particularly for children?
Well, clearly the strategy does mention that they're looking at this. I feel that I really know through our Vision Zero action plan that to move forward, you need clear and unequivocal determination that you're actually going to do something. So we're very clear at a London level that we will move residential roads to 20 miles an hour, and we will work with the London boroughs to do that. So now 21 out of the 33 London boroughs have this, and that is what's continuing to build and deliver further changes. I feel it's just a bit hesitant, the strategy currently at the national level, and that there is an opportunity with the policy to really go further and be much clearer on that, because if you don't do that, you will find too many people finding reasons not to do it. And we're back to the sort of moral choices that we've been hearing about.
You asked about strength of evidence. I mean, the evidence has been there internationally. The World Health Organization have signed off on, and many papers signing off on the importance of speed, and even the real impact in 1 or 2% reductions in speed, significantly impacting on the reduction in number of killed and seriously injured. My favourite paper is a comprehensive unified framework for analysis by Rune Elvik, and it really goes into the detail, not just the average speeds, but the distribution of speeds. So you've got theory, you've got...
Does that paper, so we'd be guilty of talking a lot about 20 mile an hour. Does that paper go beyond 20?
It specifically looks at the incremental changes. I think 20 is a mechanism to make people more aware of how important speed is, and it also achieves a reduction in speeds. Now, where it's been implemented in other areas, it hasn't always been preceded by capture of public's understanding and awareness of it initially, and focused interventions to make them more aware and understand the central role of their choices of speed, and then their support and engagement for the measures. And if we did that and got that right, they'd actually be demanding that we introduce 20 mile an hour limits in their areas, and we'd be much less resistant and form much less opposition, because it's just absolutely clear. So you've got theory and you've got observed effects of the actual power of small reductions in speed wherever it has happened internationally. There isn't a lack of evidence, there's a lack of willpower and following through and putting it into action intervention.
I did cut you off, Phil, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. So, no, I was going to say, I mean, the evidence for me, in terms of academic peer review, no. But I think the sheer scale of the let's call it the experiment or the change that's been made, there's absolutely no doubt that it has had the effect that was entirely predictable. As Rob said, the evidence is clear. The task force report that I chaired, it was very clear. The evidence was collected and said this will happen if this will benefit. And the relative changes in speed were in line with what was predicted, and the reduction in casualties was in line with what was predicted. So we know there's absolutely no doubt that this can be successful, and this will be successful. So I think the road safety strategy, in my view, doesn't pay enough heed to that evidence. But I mean, taking your point, I think while urban areas are hugely important, I think I looked at the numbers. 45% of KSIs are in built-up areas, so we have to focus on built-up areas, and we have to think about 20 as central. But we mustn't ignore the contribution that we need to make on rural roads, particularly single carriageway.
We're going to come. We've got some specific questions about the Welsh experience. Rob, you just referenced an international study. Could you just name it, and if we haven't already got it, could you send it to us, please?
So it was in the submission.
It was in the
submission. It's Rune Elvik, so it's not an international study. It is the expertise that the World Health Organization based their sort of speed impact tool on. So its formal title is a comprehensive and unified framework for analysing the effects on injuries of measures influencing speed by Rune Elvik, Accident Analysis and Prevention, looking for a year, 2019.
That's fine. It's so the point, and it's linked to the evidence that you submitted in writing. So it's discoverable on our website. So that's fine.
If we just say very brief, what it talks about is the effect of small reductions in speed. I think is it 1 kilometre is 8% reduction in casualties. So I think this is one thing I would just very quickly add is the focus of so much of speed limit policy is around compliance. And it's interesting, what the indicator that's in the road strategy is about compliance. Compliance is not the end. You can be complying with the wrong speed limit. So what we should be measuring is actual speed and reductions in speed. So those small changes in speed that have a disproportionate effect on reduction in casualties, and that's the key message from that Elvik paper.
Okay, thank you. Go on, Adrian.
Can I just add to what Phil was saying about Wales and the evidence and whether it's been peer reviewed or not? What's also interesting is that if you compare the 20-30 mile an hour roads in Wales with other roads, those other roads did not see any change in casualties. By the same token, if you compare it with England, again, there was no change. In that period, there was no change. So I think the benchmarking is pretty clear. And it's interesting that when the Wales default was declared at 2020 for us, we were slightly nervous because we'd seen the evidence from Bristol and from London and from Edinburgh and all sorts of places. Is this going to happen in Wales? And of course it did. So we were absolutely delighted. And then after a year, we thought, maybe the next year's results aren't quite as good, and they were. So I think if you look at the change quarter by quarter, it's very consistent.
Okay.
So I'm almost certain that a peer-reviewed would come up with that.
I always think it's a shame we don't know which are the lives that have been saved, because I think if you were able to present that, it would change everything.
You can't identify them.
That's right. We're not going to rerun the model too. No, sorry.
Sorry.
Could I just put it very briefly in numbers? So the paper I referred to is what's behind a speed impact tool, and it's a way of predicting what change in speed would achieve. So very briefly, two figures. So drivers choosing to travel at 27 miles an hour rather than 30 reduce the risk of fatalities by 33% and seriously injured people by 26%. And if we look at an average speed going from 30 to 20, which isn't obviously the same as applying a 20 mile an hour limit, but if we achieve compliance, it reduces fatal collisions from 70 to 72% of what they were before, and a reduction in serious injuries by 62%. That's the magnitude that the models predict, and it's the best model that we have at the moment. And wherever it's actually seen, and those reductions in actual speeds are actually average speeds are seen, it does replicate the model.
Okay, right. Thank you very much. Ollie.
Thank you, Chair. You've talked about your views on the strategy's level of ambition for reducing killed and severely injured rates. One of the things that isn't talked about very much in the strategy is Vision Zero. So do you feel that adopting Vision Zero at a national level is realistic and something that should have been considered in the strategy?
Could I start on that? Being the author of the original Vision Zero strategy for London, and I've worked for many years with other international cities and countries on this. And I can actually really understand the hesitation perhaps of officials and ministers at that point, because when we launched the Vision Zero action plan in London and set a goal of eliminating death and serious injury from the roads by 2041, it was considered quite audacious. And yet, in driving that through and changing the tone of the debate to say this is not a everyday occurrence, this is not an acceptable outcome of how we use the roads network, it has fundamentally changed the way we make decisions as a city, both in London boroughs and in Transport for London. And I know that as the Chief Safety Officer, because it allows that intolerance of an acceptability that death and injury will happen. So you are always, so clearly things aren't perfect in London and road danger still exists, but there is that intolerance of it. And so when something happens, you go further and you question every single investment decision that you are making. So I do feel emotionally, which is at the heart of what politics ultimately is about, it is hugely important to have that kind of commitment and that strength that actually, do we really want to change things? Yes, you really want to, because what number is acceptable?
Exactly. Yeah.
13? 25? Last year, 96 people were killed on London's roads. For me, that's unacceptable, and it won't be acceptable until it's zero.
Any other thoughts?
Well, and say, as Lilli said, what other number would you choose? Yes, it's audacious. It's a really good word. It's audacious. It's ambitious, but it has to be the aim, doesn't it? In any industry, in any other mode of transport, what would be acceptable target for the railways to kill people, or airlines? We couldn't put a number on it. So, why would we set anything else as the long-term objective?
So, slightly different take on that. So, yes, absolutely, it has to be the principle, because there shouldn't be a level of harm that we accept. But I think messaging is important. Again, public engagement is important, and understanding of drivers is important. In some areas, if you say Vision Zero, people react against it because they say zero is absolute, it's never going to be achievable, it's unrealistic, it's so far away from where we are, it seems impossible, so they give up. So absolutely, it should be the principle driving things, and it's zero avoidable deaths. Even if you just put in that little avoidable deaths on our roads, it makes it more understandable to people, because it's not so absolute. It's like saying infinity or zero. So yes, it should be at the principle, but whether it's brilliant if we achieve 65% reduction in the next 10 years and 70% reduction in children. That'd go further than we have in the last couple of decades. So the principle is absolutely right. How to best engage policymakers and the public is a different question.
We're going to be exploring some of that a bit later on. Adrian, any thoughts from you on Vision Zero?
I would just echo what other people said. You need that as a long-term goal. 65% by 2035 is a pretty ambitious and gets you a long way there. Yeah. You probably need some interim targets as well. How are we doing by 2028, 2030 as well? So I think it's a journey, isn't it? That we're going towards, and yes, absolutely, Vision Zero must be the end goal.
Okay, thank you very much. We're now going to go on to speed and road danger. Scott.
Okay, so I'll ask a slightly leading question. So we've established that speed is a factor. So is that because when we reduce speeds, the severity is less significant, or is it because accidents themselves are less likely?
Both.
Well, anybody want to expand on just the one-word answer?
Well, I mean, in terms of the kinetic energy, half mv squared, that's how it works. You can't argue with physics. So a small increase in speed is the square of the velocity is the energy that's dissipated on impact, and so it's simple. But yes, in terms of reaction time, it changes the driver's perception of the road ahead, and it gives them more time to look and to avoid casualty and time to brake. So that if you're doing a certain speed and you stop a metre from the child, then there's no injury that takes place. So at 1 mile an hour faster, you may not have been able to do that. So.
I mean, I think just to expand on it, because we've talked a lot about 20s, but it is also manifest on strategic roads as well, and we have reduced top-level speed limits on some of the strategic roads in London. So it allows more time to react, and it reduces the severity because of the physical impact is less. So on both of those factors, it is absolutely critical.
And Rob, you said in your evidence the predominant risk factor and controllable variable within road safety system is speed. So predominant risk factor, that's different from cause, isn't it? So, or would you just
I'd probably equate them. I'm not.
I have lots of people who tell me they're great drivers and they should be able to drive in line with the road conditions. But you're saying that speed isn't actually an issue.
Speed is the predominant issue because it increased speed increases the risk of collisions. Unexpected things happen on our roads every day. And sometimes when we're thinking and talking about speed, there's an assumption that everyone else is obeying the rules and driving sensibly, and that there's not going to be any children or vulnerable adults doing odd things, or vehicles, or animals, or trees down, or anything of that nature. But if at impact we can reduce the actual impact speed, that relates to the forces on the human body, and our frail mammalian bodies, blood and bone, have a biomechanical tolerance, and if you exceed that, and it's pretty much 20 for pedestrians, then the risk of death and injury are much, much greater than if you can achieve enough safety reserve in our systems such that if there are collisions, because there will be collisions, errors do happen, but errors are different to people choosing to ignore the rules and drive too fast for the conditions, and that's the absolute key.
So, and just on that, we know from analysis of collisions in London that excess speed, so it doesn't mean exceeding the speed limit, but speeding too fast for the conditions is involved in at least 50% of serious and fatal injuries. So it is the main causal contributing factor, so to go directly to your question.
And coming back to the control, we have a system, that roads and mobility is a system, it's a man-made construct, isn't it? Every bit of it is in our control. We create the cars, we regulate the human drivers, we decide how often they're licensed and checked and things. And the regulation and the enforcement and the penalties that are outcomes when people transgress the rules. So it's a balance between mobility and speed and a choice of restrictions and regulation versus safety. Safety for drivers and other road users. At the moment, the pivot point where we are on the seesaw is far too much away from safety. If we introduced a ban on speed, zero speed, there will be no injuries. Clearly not viable, not practical, because then we'd lose mobility and all the other benefits. But we need to come back much more towards the realities of safety, and that's where sort of Vision Zero really has power, because you really start to think every time there's an incident, or even a near miss and things we can learn, why did those drivers choose and think it was acceptable to drive at those speeds and undertake that risk or cause that risk to others and to themselves?
And if I can just add, causation is always very subjective. Collisions, casualties always have multiple causations. If this happened, this happened, this happened. But speed is common. The energy embodied in the moving vehicle is common to every collision. Some factors with this drug driving, drink driving is only a subset of the population, a subset of incidents. But speed is common to everything. So yeah, it is the most important factor in our view.
I've seen a report which was sent to me just this week by a local council about a particular road where there have been 6 incidents, and in the detail they say that 3 of them had speed as a cause. When I looked at the detail, I thought speed has been a cause or a factor in all 6. If that person, if one of the people had been driving a bit slower, maybe that wouldn't have happened. So I think it's underreported. Is part of the problem, and we feel different when we're walking than when we're cycling and when we're in a car. And yes, when I'm in a car, I sort of feel a bit invulnerable, and I probably don't always drive as well to the conditions as I think. So I think that perception of how you're doing, because the average driver thinks they're better than the average driver. I mean, that's what all the data tells us. I'm not going to say whether I am or not.
Yeah, the rules are for other people. So if we've established that speed is a big factor, what other issues, what other things can we manage to improve road safety in addition to speed, Lilli?
So just to be, and I'm glad you asked, because it is really important to just see speed as part of the system. So our Vision Zero action plan clearly sets out a range of actions across all elements of what we call a safe system. So in terms of vehicles in particular, one of the things we think the strategy could go further on is on the safety of heavy goods vehicles. So for in London, for example, we have required additional safety features to enhance the visibility from the driver of the surroundings. Through what we call our direct vision standard. We know that has basically halved the number of casualties resulting. So on average now, 6 fewer people are being killed by heavy goods vehicles and around 15, 17 fewer people are seriously injured. The European Commission has adopted that as part of vehicle standards. That ethos needs to drive through into the strategy. Similarly, we have a bus safety standard that goes much further than the normal safety standard. So you can do things with vehicles. And some of the great thing in the strategy was the recognition of technology. And actually, I think all of those measures should be required and adopted because they, with very little impediment or hindrance to drivers, would actually just make the drive safer, easier, and more relaxing, and definitely safer. So all of those measures are hugely important. You need to change the roads. You will see outside Parliament there are cycle lanes. There are ways of creating and segregating vulnerable road users from main roads. That is essential, as is education. And then finally, enforcement. The role of the police is critical. So our plan is a joint plan between the London boroughs, who manage 95% of the road network, the London Police, Transport for London, and other agencies. Collaboration is a key part of this, and I think that could come through even more strongly in the strategy.
Okay, it's a shame the Road Haulage Association isn't here today to answer some of those points, but never mind. So, anything else on that? We all okay? Oh, Rob?
Can I just come back? So, I mean, essentially what you're talking about was speed, and there are other factors. Of course, there are other factors. The safe system, which is referenced in the strategy, divides it into the 5 pillars or components. And something that I believe is the insufficient focus is put to the writing around the circle. So you've got your 5 components, safe roads and roadsides, safe road users, safe speed, safe vehicles, post-crash response. But the leadership and coordination and the messaging and the public's awareness, attitudes and cultures around road safety. I think that's a missing element. Not enough is being put into that. And there are behavioural scientists and research academics that have tools to measure where a population is, introduce interventions real time, so not waiting, not causing delay, real time, and observe the impacts of those. And we need to harness those to a much greater degree. As I said earlier, if we got it right, if people understood the harsh realities that were out there, they would be demanding this, and they wouldn't be choosing to drive in the manners they are, because they'd understand that the driver has ultimate responsibility. At the end of the day, we've got a system, and it's got all sorts of components, but ultimately, final decision is a driver decides consciously to get into a car in whatever condition it is, in whatever condition they're in, and chooses at what speeds to drive it around other human beings. And this isn't about blaming a driver. We see them in the context of the system and try and understand why they're making unwise decisions where they are. And we need to put in the awareness, enforcement, regulation that will reduce the tragedy that's happening out there.
And I think maybe just to add to that is the choice of cars that people buy. Yeah. I think people do not understand the relationship, particularly with bonnet height, and the impact that it has on pedestrians, particularly child pedestrians.
But we're going to come on to...
Indeed, but I think... So the government... Yes, sorry.
No, it is important, but yeah. Okay, right. Scott again? Speed and driver behaviour.
Yes, so people's attitudes towards speed. It's interesting, isn't it? Because sometimes when someone gets caught speeding and fined, it's treated as they've been unlucky to have been caught. And it's not unusual to see on a local community Facebook page a warning that the speed cops are out trying to catch criminals. Indeed. In the way that we don't want burglars or shoplifters that they might get caught, but for some reason it's acceptable, isn't it, to speed?
So there's a couple of bits around that. One is the reality that we're in a blind spot. We've all evolved and we've lived and grown up with vehicles mobility being a background everyday part of our lives. and somehow things have got out of kilter, we've got out of touch. I'd just like to introduce the concept from Professor Ian Walker. He's a British environmental psychologist, and he uses the term Matson normativity. One of the previous inquiry committees had reference to it. And he describes it as society's unconscious bias towards cars. It refers to a cultural blind spot where people automatically accept driving as the default and normal transport mode, often suspending their usual ethical and moral standards when judging driving behaviours. It explains how people are able to apply double standards to road use that would be completely unacceptable anywhere else, like flying and drink or drugs. They ignore alternative options to driving that are often healthier and possible, and they defend the status quo, so they're resistant to our introduction of measures that will make it safer for everyone. So I think there's some really interesting things in there. One of the other things that was mentioned was the concept of, what was it, pluralistic ignorance. I think that was really interesting. It was in, I think, the previous session. And it's not a term I'd been familiar with, but I think it's real. So the way it was described is a number of vociferous opponents are much louder in their expression of opposition and resistance to interventions like 20-mile-an-hour limits and anything else that makes it safer. And people that actually hold a majority view and are in favour and support of more safety and 20-mile-an-hour limits remain muted and quieter because they believe that they're part of a minority and might be ostracised. And actually what then policymakers and the general sort of perception is that the minority, louder group, are actually the majority, where they're not. It's actually the reverse. And we have lots of questionnaires, lots of surveys saying how important road safety is to people and how they want their communities to feel safer and to reduce the costs and deaths and injuries.
Within that context then, I mean, the government's devolving powers to local authorities across Scotland, across the UK, so across England and Wales, to look at speed. Is that the right thing to do? You think they should just do what happened in Wales and take that central decision?
They didn't. They didn't do that in Wales.
Apologies.
No, they'll come back to that.
Do you think they should devolve the right thing to do?
I personally don't. I think it should be nationally set. Now, how government and that side of things works out. So I'm a frontline clinician. I don't understand how the dynamics work, but I think it has to be nationally set and delivered and prioritised. How then that gets localised to an appropriate degree, I don't understand those dynamics. So I defer to your expertise on that.
Lilli,
I think national leadership and national policy setting is absolutely critical. But it is really clear that regions and cities can make progress in the absence of it.
And it's happening.
Yeah, so if fatalities have fallen, faster further in London than they have in any other national city, and that's a clear trend year on year because of the policies. But I do think you do need that leadership, and that so the commitment within strategy to set the policy, to review it, and to be bold on it. I think there's something very important about what you say about challenging the tenor of the whole discussion. If it's never talked about at a national level, it's a priority. If reducing road death is never talked about, which it is now that we have got a strategy, there was a whole period when we didn't, then it's very difficult for regions to make the progress they need. So obviously local highway authorities set the standard. That is what happens now. I do believe there's some merits in that, but it definitely needs national leadership.
The UK government could set a national limit of 20 in urban areas, and individual local authorities could opt out of that.
Indeed.
Whereas it's opposite, which is happening, isn't it?
What's the most effective and urgent and way that we could do this? Because every day we don't, more people are dying that could have been prevented.
There are some things that require national action. So, for example, if they were to mandate the 18 safety technical features in all vehicles, then that would require in a stroke you would have vehicles being intelligently adapted to the speed limit in their area.
But only in new cars.
We have actually retrofitted our vehicle fleet at Transport for London. So,
it would take time for most cars.
It would, but that reduced speeding incidents by 63% in our fleet. So very quickly, if you take the leadership and you mandate those kind of technological, then you will already reap the benefits of the limits we have. And when you reduce the limits to lower limits, you will, and it's that kind of speed of action I think is needed to be aligned to the targets that we've set at a national level.
If I could just come on the kind of question of public attitude. I think we mustn't think that public attitudes are immutable. They do change. I think what we're seeing in London, what we're seeing in Wales increasingly, is that once we have wide area 20 miles, and that becomes the norm, there's an increased normalisation. The view was at the task force stage that we would see compliance increase over time. At the moment, it's pretty flat. I mean, there was a concern that we would see a dip and then it would creep back to normal. That's not happening. It is certainly flat. And I think as we get increasing vehicle technology, I mean, on the pace car point, it's something that we actually recommended to the Welsh Government, that all the public fleet, I mean, there's thousands, millions of vehicles are run by the public sector. If they were all fitted with ISA as retrofitted, and they act as pace cars, and we could also get the public themselves to opt in and become pace car drivers. We don't need every vehicle to be obeying the speed limit to influence the majority of the traffic flow. Yes. So we can do a lot. What's kind of interesting on the pluralistic ignorance point, there was that concern because there was the view that this was tremendously unpopular. And actually, there was a silent majority in Wales that was supporting this, but we had this very loud minority. There was actually reluctance of public authorities to take those steps because of the fear of backlash. So the point of having leadership to show the need for this, I think is hugely important. Whether or not it's an immediate law change, as is done in Wales, or a policy change that sets a very clear sense of direction, that is what's needed, and then local authorities will be given that support to make those changes.
So on the attitude point, the big criticism of the 20 scheme in Edinburgh is it's reduced average speeds by less than 2 miles per hour. And but what it's also done is it's really reduced the speeds of the fastest vehicles. So I guess on the attitude point, I guess maybe the counter-argument is, well, why bother reducing the speed limit? Should we not just be educating drivers to stick to the existing speed limit?
Because you can't achieve that through education. And even
there's no hope of changing attitude. We have to reduce limits.
Would you rather be hit by a car doing 29 and a 30 or a car doing 25 and a 20? Yeah, it's about speed. It's not about compliance. So compliance with the wrong speed limit is no success, which is the point that I made. The indicator in the road safety strategy that's going to measure speed compliance, in my view, is the wrong measure unless we've got the right speed limits to begin with.
So there's no hope of changing attitudes then?
No. I'm saying exactly the opposite. I think there's huge hope of changing attitudes.
We do it via changing speed limits, so that's how we change attitudes.
It's one way, or the two go hand in hand. We need to change public attitude and demonstrate to politicians that there is a silent majority in favour of this, and then they'll make the right choices because of the pluralistic ignorance point that Rob.
So recruit the expertise that was in behavioural scientists to get them to understand and map out what the current attitude is, because we actually don't know. I don't think that work's been done. You get windows into it. Yeah. Once you know where the starting point is, you can launch campaigns in education awareness and try and change it and understand which identities people are relating to that are keeping them in unsafe decision-making modes. So it's both. And on the compliance thing, I think compliance is really important because we have a system. It's a technological and behavioural and social system of road use, don't we? It's roads, vehicles, people. And if the message we're giving is we're setting speed limits, but we're not really going to take them seriously, it doesn't really matter if you comply or not, we totally lose control of the whole system. It's the predominant factor that can change this. So we need to you mentioned Vision Zero, we have zero tolerance for excess speeding. For breaking the speed limit would be a start, for speeding in inappropriate conditions, more complicated but desirable. But absolutely zero tolerance for willful choice of exceeding the speed limit. That would be a brilliant start, and it's doable. There's the technology out there, data in vehicles that measure how fast they're going and know what the speed limits on the roads are. It may be seen as unpopular, and there may be hesitancy from a sort of popularity and support point of view. But again, if you've got road safety literacy, the consistent messaging, understanding, awareness, and people saw and understood or realised that the impact of their choices and the choice to go a bit faster or a bit closer, how that massively increases speed, the risk of serious injury and death, they would choose otherwise. It's both. It's all of these components acting together. I think the big missing component at the moment is the public awareness and attitude and focusing on that to gain support for everything else we're talking about.
So I'll come back to you. So in part of that, in your evidence, you said that drivers don't always understand the impact of relatively small increases in speed.
I don't think they do, and I don't think policymakers do, and that's what partly what that paper and there was an Agilicis paper that referred to it as well. So it's intuitive to all of us. If you've got someone that speeds massively, there's going to be massively increased risk. You need a broader understanding of systems and whole systems behaviour and risk levels to appreciate, and it's only been understood sort of fairly recently, in the last few years, that a greater number of people going a little bit too fast across our network massively increases the risks to everyone in a way that is probably more significant than the few who are exceptionally speeding. And part of it's the number of interactions, because there's so many more vehicles on the roads, they're driving much closer, people are behaving in slightly different ways, that the net effect across the system of small changes and averages are really impactful on reducing injuries and deaths. I mean, you do have to focus on the excessive speeders as well, don't get me wrong. They're disproportionately high, but a much smaller number of interactions than people that habitually choose to go a bit faster.
Mm. So I just want to I don't want to misunderstand. I'm not saying compliance isn't important. I'm saying that don't start by measuring compliance, because if you're measuring compliance with the wrong speed limits, then you make it the wrong measure of success. But yes, I'm not saying 25 and 20 is acceptable, but let's set the speed limit first and then achieve compliance later in the long term, whether that's through technology or greater enforcement or whatever. But I just wanted to kind of pick up on what Rob was saying about public attitudes. And so what we recommended in the Welsh task force was that before the Welsh Government brought in the legislation to change the default speed limit, they would carry out what was called a national conversation with the Welsh population about what the residential roads and streets were for, and the expectation was...
We'll come on to Wales later, won't we?
We're going to come on to
well, I was just going to say... I mean,
it's about behaviour, so yeah, because I've also got a question on this.
I guess my point is they didn't do that.
They didn't do it. Okay.
So that understanding of the motivations of people speeding, their attitudes to speed, that was exactly what was recommended, as Rob said, by behavioural scientists at the university. But it wasn't done.
Yeah. I mean, so we've talked about the sort of more carrot side and the behaviour side. Obviously, in outer London, where I am, a lot of 20-mile-an-hour residential roads. What I don't see is much enforcement. Am I right that there's not much enforcement? If so, why is that? I mean, I have been caught doing 24 and a 20, but it does that, and you see an awful lot of people clearly going, oh, I know there's no speed camera, and I've always driven at 30 plus, so I'm not going to slow down here now. I know why the roads that are 20 have been designated as 20, but then that's because I live and breathe this stuff. But where does enforcement fit into the 20 element?
Yeah, no, so I'll just pick up on behalf of London, because you framed it, but it would be the same everywhere. So it is really important, it's both from an educational point of view, and we do have a lot of marketing and communications which do make exactly that critical point that I didn't know I was going a bit too fast, and that can have devastating outcomes. So we work with the Metropolitan Police they do enforce in 20s. London is a very big place with around 27 million journeys taking place every day. And we know one of the objectives they took on in the last Vision Zero action plan was to greatly increase the number of enforcement notices that they issue each year. So that's increased from around 150, 200,000 to over 800,000 notices of prosecution every year. And those aren't just on the high-speed roads, those do include 20s. And we've also now remodelled and rechanged the deployment of the roads policing force in London with a road danger team, which will be much more mobile and will be moving around. That will create more of a presence that you hopefully will see and feel. Nevertheless, I would just say, and it's back to sort of the point that Phil was making, there is too much speeding in those 20-mile-an-hour zones. Nevertheless, you can see it, and it really annoys me, and it really annoys local citizens. They are still delivering safety benefits, and we know that from the 10-year research that we've done, because those results were delivered with the current deployment, and perhaps actually less enforcement actually happening. So just because you are bringing down average speeds, now I want people to drive at the speed limit or less, so that would really get me towards my Vision Zero goal, and that's why we'll continue to work really hard with the Met Police on this. But it's why also the technologies like speed limiters, and also, and we'll come on to it hopefully at some point, much greater and access to new camera technology, which is being blocked through the Home Office type approval system. We need to be able to use that much more intelligently and unlock the power of enforcement.
It'd be good if you can give us a breakdown of those tickets for speeding, just to see what proportion do go to 20.
Oh, we absolutely can do that.
That'd be really good, actually.
Yeah, we'll
so just a bit of detail then. So in London, if I live on a street which is a 20 and average speed is way above that, how do you react to that? Do you just phone up the police and hope that they'll enforce, or do you actually come along and think about installing physical measures on the street?
So depends who the highway authority is. So 95% of the roads in London are owned and managed by a local borough. No, don't worry. But the main roads are Transport for London. And this is what local communities do every day. It's probably what the biggest postbag is for a ward councillor, is about speeding and road danger concerns. So they will work with the local policing forces, and the new road danger reduction team, in terms of their deployment, can go and focus. They can do mobile camera enforcement, for example, on your road, if that was the case. If there is a need for physical changes, the local borough can indeed introduce them, or maybe do mobile deployment. So there are a range of measures, but obviously it's very seldom that you're going to have an impact road by road. You need to think about it across the whole borough. But sanctions do apply, and people do get speeding notices.
Good to see that data, actually.
Yeah, no, we will.
So I'll go to Adrian now, and then I'll have a kind of one last question before I move on.
Can I just add on the data on enforcement? 2020 for us has done a freedom of information request to all the police forces in Great Britain over the last 3 or 4 years, and the level of enforcement of different speed limits does not relate to the risk on those speed limits. It's highly variable.
But Lilli was saying that in London they're being more nuanced about where they place the enforcement based on
London is showing us the way. I'm just saying that and there are other forces. You know, if you go to Avon and Somerset, you know, they're good about this stuff. Other forces they're not relating the enforcement to the risk.
Yeah.
And
okay.
so
can I just pick up on that?
There's a clear message there. Yeah, okay,
can I pick up on the enforcement and policing side of things? So, particularly for 20, I don't think we should lean too much on the police and enforcement to expect them to achieve that for us. If we get the messaging and public awareness right, it will drive itself. The police monitoring and enforcement is for the occasional transgressors, not the sort of mainstay. And we know it's effective. We know that people currently have a very low perceived risk of being caught, and the penalties don't reflect the risks. So at the moment, the ACPO recommendation on speeding for 30, and I'll relate to 30, is that enforcement doesn't kick in till 35 miles an hour. Now, the risk of 35 miles an hour rather than 30 miles an hour is an increase in fatalities of 90% and an increase in severe injuries of 62%. The penalties we see that only kick in at 35 do not relate to those. You know, people actually laugh about it and say, oh, I got sent on an enforcement campaign, which is now, I think, online, isn't it? It should be severe points and severe penalties, so the negative consequences that people perceive and experience are true inhibitors.
Yeah. Are the government spending enough on the public information messaging that I remember in my youth?
No, it's completely absent, isn't it?
Yeah.
They're not tapping into what is now known by behavioural scientists about behavioural change. You know,
I think this is, for me, this is where the strategy is really lacking. There's very little in there about what will be the strategy for increasing compliance, for reducing speeds. You know, it could be about greater resources for police enforcement. It could be about local authorities being given powers to enforce speed limits, which has been proposed in London. It could be about community pledge systems. It could be about pace cars. It could be about a stronger commitment to ISA. But it's really silent. You know, what are we going to do to increase compliance? And that should be an absolute focus of the strategy. And it's silent on that at the moment. It doesn't really talk about that at all.
Adrian, very quickly, because I need to move on to my last question.
I was just going to an anecdote of using a Lime bike to get here today. I was zipping along at 15 miles an hour on the main road, and then I went off onto the embankment where there's lots of residential properties, and I can't do more than 6 or 7 miles an hour. And then I get back on the main road, I can do 15 miles an hour. That's great. as using a bike. Well, we can do that in cars. The technology is not the problem. We could do that now. But it is about the education.
And along would come someone saying you're restricting their freedoms, but never mind. That's we're overliving these days.
But it's freedom to harm other people.
Exactly.
Is that the freedom?
I've been back decades, but I have an image in my mind of a TV advert put out by the government around a child in a car.
Yes.
And
it's
completely
absent. The public information film has disappeared. We just don't see them anymore. And I think there's a huge role for government here to increase people's understanding of the reality of this.
Okay, I'm going to. So we're going to. The next section is about 20 miles an hour, but I'll just get it started. So again, asking a slightly leading question. So should we be doing 20 mile an hour at scale? Or should we just do it where we know there's been accidents or perhaps outside schools and things like that? Why not focus on outside schools and where there's accidents?
It's like children only exist at school. I mean, I think... Rod King put this really well. We don't see children in the public domain anymore. We just don't see them. The only time adults see children is at start and end of school times. And we think that's the only place they exist. So that's where you need 20 miles an hour. I think it's really, really... unfortunate, and I think it speaks to the loss of children's independence. I'll leave Adrian to comment, but for me, there's absolute evidence that wide area 20 mile an hour it's cheaper, it's more effective, it's more understandable, and it's
Does the evidence show that?
Yes, absolutely.
And I mean, I agree with Phil, of course, as you'd expect. But our analysis is that at least 80% of child casualties do not occur outside the school gate. So everybody agrees that you should have 20 mile an hour around schools. I think I don't think there's anybody in this room who doesn't say that, but that's not where the casualties are. Yes. They are in every other walk of life for children. And I mean, interestingly, the target for children is reduced KSIs is 70%, not 65%, and something like 80% of those occur in urban areas. So if you're going to reach your 70%, 20 miles an hour is even more important for that particular target.
Just to add, as a highway authority as well, it's much cheaper and more efficient to introduce on an area basis. In terms of you are entering, your obligation is to indicate to the driver you're entering that zone and make it very clear. But if you're doing it street by street, you literally have to change the signs at the end of every single street, and the costs are prohibitive and not effective.
And it's also confusing for drivers. I'm driving down one street and it's 30, I'm driving down the next street, it's 20.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm driving down the next street and it goes from a 20 mile an hour limit to a 20 mile an hour zone, and it's got a big sign saying end of 20 miles an hour. Yeah. Oh, but it still has 20 miles an hour, because so it's a complete mess. And you have to do it. What you do is you set. If you look at any town in England, Wales, or Scotland, and you drew a kilometre radius around every school, and said, right, we're going to have 20 miles an hour a kilometre around every school, that would be the whole town. And then all you then do is you say, well, okay, we'll do the whole town. We'll set the gateways. And then we'll say, oh, but that road there, that's got protected cycleways. Yep. Actually, there aren't many pedestrians or cyclists there. We can raise that to 30.
I was going to come on to signage later, but I'm going to ask it now, because, as I say, living and representing an outer London borough area, I think one of the most confusing things to drivers, asking for a friend and constituents and fellow London MPs. Is the clutter, seeing the signage, apparently 20 painted on the road is not a statutory requirement. The repeater signs are, and yet as a driver, the painting on the road is much clearer.
Yes, indeed.
Because it doesn't get messed up with the clutter. You can miss a repeater sign because there's a van in the way or a bush overgrowing. That to me should be a factor. How clear is the signage, but also the disjoint. Windmill Lane, going up from Cyan Lane through towards Three Bridges, 30, 40, 30, 40,
yes.
For the other way round. A4 through the borough of Hounslow, 40, 30, 40. What is, and that is, that's a TfL road. Windmill Lane is an Ealing and a Hounslow road. So what can be done to make life consistent for drivers, even within a single local authority area? We'll come on to different local authority areas later.
So I'll just kick off because I can see lots of fingers. So, I mean, you articulated the problem brilliantly. Some of this is because highway authorities are required under the manual for street design to use the signage in that way. So the government's committed to revising that guidance. It's a brilliant opportunity to streamline and make it much, much simpler. And we would welcome that and could bring all sorts of your experience and others to do so. Clearly our experience is that a more consistent driving experience is going to improve that goal of compliance, which is what we're seeking to do. So our road network is not perfect, and we've committed to review the speed limits and to bring them down on strategic roads where appropriate, so you get that more consistent experience. But it also goes back to the original point that we were talking about, having default policies, because then people's expectation, if we knew that residential roads were 20 by default, unless they were signed differently, you don't have to have all the clutter to tell you that. Yes, it's something you know because you're taught it. But that's my point of view, and I think that there is an opportunity with the revision of national guidance to streamline this.
Meanwhile, will TfL be looking at the actual the required speed limits on the A roads in London?
Yes,
please?
we are. So the Vision Zero Action Plan definitely commits to doing that. So both to extending 20s by around a further 65 kilometres, but also reviewing the speed limits on the other strategic roads to make sure they're
because
consistent.
they're coming from 40 down to 30, but there's
and they won't all do that, but there has to be, there's an intention
there's inconsistencies on the same stretch of road, which is people see as just a money spinner for TfL or the council.
To be really clear, none of the speed enforcement money in London or elsewhere goes to the local authority. It goes
we know that it's the political pushback that we get.
Just on the consistency point, so obviously there was a big backlash in Wales, we know that, and we can explore the reasons why, but much of that came from the inconsistencies and so a big area of concern for drivers was that change 2030. So I think there is a real benefit to consistency, as well as Lilli said, the cost-effectiveness. Just on the roundels point, certainly our understanding is a roundel on the painted on the road is perfectly legal as an alternative.
It's not illegal, but it's not statutory requirement.
As an alternative to the upright sign. You don't have to. That's our understanding is that they are the two are equated. So, and I agree with you. I think a painted roundel is very hard for a driver to miss. It's much more effective. But just going back to the current questions on Scott, I thought I'd just leave you with this lovely quote. I was at a road safety conference recently in Birmingham, and Mode Shift Stars, if you know them, they work with schools to kind of encourage more children to walk in cycles. So they've set up these things called active travel ambassadors for schools, so young people. And there was a young girl on the stage, and she said, which was a lovely quote, we can't have a childhood that you can't walk through, which I thought was quite profound, really. So we have to have a childhood we can walk through. In other words, we have to have an environment that we can experience we can't be in our bedrooms on screens. And so this is much more about around school. This is about an urban environment that children feel able to be in and to have an element of independence. And we've seen the loss of children's independence. So I think we mustn't ignore the benefits of lower speed limits, not just in terms of road safety, but just in the way in which people, young people particularly, can live their lives.
And to your point about street clutter, well, in terms of road speed limit signing, this comes because we're setting national speed limits which are too high. And then you have to tell drivers you can only do a lower speed than that. If the national speed limits were lower, but that you could go faster on certain roads, you wouldn't need a sign, would you?
We're coming on to setting speed, who sets speed limits. Scott, are you done?
I think,
Right, okay, back to Ollie.
Thank you, Chair. You've all been very clear on the advantages you see in 20 mile an hour speed limits and the benefits that they bring. So given that very clear evidence, and most of the road safety and road design experts are of a similar view, why are they such a culture war? Why is there this resistance? Adrian's hand shot.
Sorry, go on, Adrian. Go.
It's change management. We've got used to 30 miles an hour as the limit, and that's been with us for 100 years or so. And whenever you change, people are going to get uncomfortable. Oh, why do we need to change? I haven't been involved in a crash, and I've been quite happily driving at 30. So it's just getting used to it, And we saw the petition in Wales at the point of the change. Over 400,000 people signed this. By the way, just before many of the signs were in place, but leave that aside. There was an identical petition 2 years later, and it attracted 2,378 signatures. So, less than... sorry, I can't even do the maths in my head. But whatever, a tiny number of signatures. And of course, on social media, and it's still there, but people just get used to it.
Okay.
I think there's some truth in that. I mean, one of the things I come back to is actually question what is the level of resistance. The fact that there are groups that are loudly opposing or resistant to this change doesn't mean that the majority aren't in support. The surveys that the RAC and similar bodies do tell us that people do want reductions in speed limits and safer roads. 1,600 people killed on our roads, 29,000 seriously injured every year, 134,000 involved in other injuries, a potential saving to the economy of 54 billion. Isn't that reason enough to make people more aware of the real costs and the benefits of increased safety? And whether it's popular or not, to do the right thing to prevent that harm and those deaths? Because allowing it to continue is, within our decision making, what policies and legislation, how we align things to that reality.
I completely agree with that. Of course, we should have policy that should be trying to do the right thing, but there is this tension, and I'm perhaps speaking in general, not just on this. There is that tension, people in democratic politics, about how you strike the right balance between doing the right thing and then also not doing the thing that's going to get you booted out of office, or the thing that you think might get you booted out of office.
Indeed,
and I think that's perhaps why this whole public engagement, bringing people with us thing is important. Yes. But
and it's important to depoliticise it. Give this decision making to a body like the RSIB, make it an across-party or independent of politics, whichever government happens to be in at the time. Give them the authority to review the evidence, what's already known, and recommend actions and interventions that are going to save lives, and remove these. There's barriers to this within the driving public and their decision making, and within legislation and policy makers, and we need to understand that. What are the barriers, what are the opportunities, what are the enablers, and let's get everything lined up and actually achieve a reduction in the death and serious injury.
So I think the experience, if you look at London boroughs who very recently will have introduced this, so there are local politicians who are taking it on the chin and being very brave in introducing it, because there is always a lot of local discussion. But actually, it's been most successfully framed when they talk about it the limit is not actually what's so important. It's actually about what you want to do with your streets, and when it's married with creating safe routes to school, reformatting the high street, making the environment look nice for people walking, cycling, or for older people to access shops. These are real tangible benefits which people don't want to lose once they've got, and there are lots of bits of communities that have been remodelled along this, and we have seen in local elections that people have not actually, they've secured greater public support in the wake of doing this, and there's quite a lot of evidence of that. And so being really clear on what the benefits and what you're trying to achieve with it is absolutely critical, and you can see that rolling out. The point of the national strategy is it creates that really helpful strategic steer at national level to say this is important and this is something that we are behind local authorities doing.
And I think a clearer strategy and technical guidance also enables officers, because I know in some authorities you have pro 20 members, but officers may say to those members, yes, but of course, if we follow the government's current guidance, you can't have 20 miles per hour. We'll perhaps come on to this, but there's the kind of catch-24, which I'll steal Adrian's, which is, if speeds are above 24, you can't have 20, which is this completely perverse position that we have in current national guidance. That certainly needs to be swept away urgently, and that is holding back a lot of authorities, where officers are strictly following the current government guidance, even in the face of elected members who want to bring in 20. That is a real problem. We have to deal with something about that. So, Professor,
just one more question on this, and a short couple of sentence answers, ideally from each of you, so that we can move on. But a lot of the anti-20 mile an hour rhetoric that one sees is that 20 mile an hour limits increase journey times, increase congestion, and have a wider economic cost. Is that supported by evidence?
No.
No, because most delay in London is incurred at the junctions, not on the road network.
So you get more consistent, reliable, predictable travel times, which is of more benefit than the small reductions in some journeys. And you avoid the disruption when there is an incident and the delays and all that side of things. So commercially, individually.
Transport for Wales, before in preparation, I looked at their latest monitoring data up to March 25, and it is showing the whole range of journeys, increase in journey time no more than around 2 minutes on average, really small increases in journey times, and as you said, Robert, an increase in journey time consistency, so that you know your journey. All you do is got to leave another 2 minutes earlier and you'll be there. So and in terms of the economic effect, there's lots of research. So yes, 2 minutes, if you multiply millions of journeys by 2 minutes by the value of time that transport economics uses, you get a very big number. The reality is that makes no difference at all.
But you have to take off the saving of the consistency and the lack of disruption from getting in a big tailback because there's been a big incident.
It's reducing the speed limit on the M25. Reducing the speed limit on the M25 has actually increased the capacity of the M25.
Indeed. And the net economic benefits of this is just massive. Our calculation, we've got a calculator which says to each local authority how much it would cost you to implement this, and what the economic benefits would be, and the payback is never more than 6 months, and it's often 1 or 2 months.
While we're on the subject of economic payback, we're going to come on to some the concerns raised by a Conservative member of the Senedd, but who says the Welsh Government's own figures stated it will cost the Welsh economy about 8 billion. Where's she got that from?
Well, that's exactly what I was saying. So if you take small slivers of time, 2 minutes, over 60 years, over millions of journeys, times the value of time that transport economists use, you get a very big number. Okay. That is not a real cost.
It hasn't taken into account the other costs.
No, regardless of that, it's not a real figure.
Oh, I see.
It is not real money. This is what people, in theory, what would you pay to get to your journey, to get to your destination 2 minutes earlier? And you put a number to that, 50p.
Right. Okay, it's the old-fashioned.
It's the old. It's complete. There's lots of academic research. People can't use that 2 minutes. They get there and they sit down and watch Neighbours for 2 more minutes.
It's the same as the old-fashioned web tag.
Exactly. It's just web tag.
Scott,
it's nothing to do with the economy.
So apologies, Phil. Does that analysis? That's the I guess the consequence of the change. But in terms of the benefits, does the same analysis put a monetary value on a life saved?
Of course. And so that's but those are, in my view, those are much more tied to real costs of the economy, because we know, the health service, it really costs money to patch people up. It really costs money to send out investigators and to clean the road. These are real costs, regardless of the human suffering that is caused. And the value of time savings, in my view, are entirely illusory. And actually, the Welsh Government's impact assessment that came up with that figure quoted academic research to say it doesn't really matter. But of course, people ignore that and they just focus on the 8 billion.
But even if you believed it, a full business case would absolutely take on board the also quantified value of lives saved, plus the additional potential public health benefits and lives saved through enabling more journeys to be made actively. So when we do a full business case, we will look at all of these costs in the round. And as Adrian said, in 20 mile an hour are they have very, very strong business cases and very strong cost benefit assessment.
And it's not just to the authorities, it's the individual driver, because they use less fuel and their insurance costs come down. And I don't think that has come across to people. Oh, if I had 20 miles an hour in my area and everybody was driving a bit slower, my insurance would be 50 quid a year less. I think I might buy that.
I think the insurance thing is the real sell, actually, that's not been made enough of.
Yeah, and I didn't know. I only just learnt about that. I didn't know. I'll have to tell him indoors. In charge of the insurance. Okay, right. Back to Wales. Daniel.
Thanks, Chair. Should England follow Wales and move towards a 20 mile per hour zone as a national default speed limit on roads?
So, well, firstly, let's get away from the word zone. So Wales, so the 20 mile an hour zones, hopelessly confusing. We need to get rid of 20 mile an hour zones. They are a nonsense. I mean, Wales now, there are no 20 mile an hour zones. They are not lawful in Wales. The idea of a special zone, this special little zone and everything else is 30. Is
getting over the border.
Well, not even that. Even in England, I think the days of the 20 mile an hour zone have gone. Yeah. Let's just treat 20 miles as a speed limit. So should England do what Wales did? I think ideally I would say yes. It was extremely effective. Will it actually do it politically? I don't know. I mean, it was interesting. Scotland was minded to do the same legislative change that Wales did and kind of took fright politically and decided not to do it. So what Scotland now has is a much firmer policy default that 20 is the norm and town by town by town we will implement this. I think that's where England should, it certainly should go to. I would like it if England did what Wales did, but realistically, I think it may just be too much of a political ask at the moment. Sad to say, I think.
Can't we do it, but do it better? Do it with that awareness and public campaign beforehand, so you've got support and achieve all the benefits.
Indeed. I mean, as I say, I kind of alluded earlier that the intention was that the Welsh government would kind of roll the pitch, would carry out that engagement with the public and almost gain consent of the public to bring in the legislative change. But it didn't do that, partly because of COVID, partly because of budgets or whatever. And it only began to engage with the public, wanted to take in the decision, and then was informing the public about the change rather than gaining its consent. And I think, if England perhaps did that, perhaps. It's interesting, we don't talk enough about Northern Ireland, but Northern Ireland is recently consulted on changes to its speed limit guidance, and I'm hopeful that will also move. So and Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, also has a default policy 30. So pretty soon it'll be only.
Ireland is Republic of Ireland default 30
in urban areas. Yeah, so it has defined urban areas. It has in legislation. It has a.
That's what we have in England.
Isn't that kilometres per hour?
Sorry, kilometres. I'm sorry. 30 kilometres. Yeah.
Oh right.
Yeah, 30 kilometres. So very soon, which is 19 miles. So very soon, England will be the only nation in the British Isles that doesn't have a policy default of 20 miles per hour, 30 kilometres per hour in urban areas.
So 2020 for us was set up in order to advocate for a 20 mile an hour national speed limit, actually across the UK, and we were clearly delighted with what Wales has done. I mean, one of the reasons that Wales had to go down the legislative route was there were very few 20 mile an hour places in Wales already. Now in Scotland and in England you've got many more areas of 20 miles an hour. I mean 68 out of 154 local authorities in England are already committed to 20 miles an hour. So we've already made huge progress. So you could argue, well, actually a national legislative default would therefore be easier because a lot of people are already doing it. But you could also just say, well, look, we will set a national value of 20 miles an hour, an expectation that it's going to be 20 miles an hour, and assume that everywhere, and let local authorities accept up, actually without changing the legislation. So you could actually get almost the same effect. It might be a bit more expensive, but it might be a bit easier.
And it might take longer.
And it might take a bit longer.
That's what happened, and that's the price to be paid.
And just to say, that we've extrapolated the Welsh results to England, and our calculation is that nine fewer KSIs. If you implemented, there's 9 more KSIs per day in England because we've got 30 rather than 20. So there's 9 people being injured today and tomorrow, or dying, seriously injured or dying, today, tomorrow, every day, until we make the change. So speed is of the essence in this context.
So if I can just mix I know we've talked about Wales a bit, but the two issues, like Ruth, I'm an even more out of London MP than you, Chair. If you look at my borough, which doesn't have many 20-mile-an-hour zones, out in Bexley, and if you go on the Facebook groups, you'll see they're also, don't go to Lewisham, it's terrible, it's all 20 miles an hour. So how do we learn from Wales in terms, and you've touched on this a little bit, in terms of communication and engagement on if we were going to spread that across England?
I think we learn how not to do it.
What lessons would we learn in terms of communication engagement?
Yeah, I think we learned how not to do it. Basically, they had a very strong politician who carried it through and is no longer a member of Senedd. And he took the political hit and he was willing to do so. Not all politicians are like that. I think there needs to be much more engagement, much more, to gain the consent, the demonstrable consent of the silent majority, so that politicians can say, in the face of the vociferous opposition that will come, we are doing this for these people. We're holding up a mirror to society, and this is what people want. And, we are very confident that if you do representative surveys, proper market research that is balanced across the community of every age, every gender, and disability and ethnicity, that you will get a comprehensive, probably about a 2/3 majority in favour of 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. And you do that before you then make the change, and you do that change. So when the loud voices come, you can say, yes, but you are the minority. Look, we know that you're the minority. We are doing this on behalf of the silent majority.
And I think what you will find, and will strengthen every politician who's then having to well, first, two things. One, if it's a policy default, you're having to argue why you're not doing it, as opposed to why you should do it. And I actually think in many of our outer London conversations that would change the balance quite significantly, because the evidence is so clear now. So you are literally having to argue why it is acceptable that your children and your citizens on your streets are more at risk than they should be.
And not just that, you mentioned earlier, selling and promoting the benefits, all the other benefits to communities, and linking it to other agendas, and particularly the health, the physical health and mental health of the whole community and nation. So I think there's really something in that. There's a really positive approach to it.
Can I just give you some examples of what we've experienced with 2020 in Kent? First of all, it's worth saying that KCC did a study a few years ago in which they did representative market research, and they found that across all of the districts in Kent, between 60 and 80% of people were supportive of 20 miles an hour. So, and that helped to change the policy. And KCC, the policy is not perfect, but they've gone as far as they can within the existing guidance. They introduced, actually at the time of COVID, 2 20-mile-an-hour places, one in Tunbridge and one in Faversham. The level of opposition in both places was about the same. The difference was that in Faversham there was a huge amount of support, which there wasn't in Tunbridge. And that was simply because of much better engagement at a local level. And in fact, 20 miles an hour has gone into both places, and it's been just as successful in both, and it's accepted and so on. But that level of pre-engagement is really important. And I think that I think I'm right in saying that when 2020 was part of the initial thought process in Wales, there was a recommendation that 10% of the budget should be on marketing and advertising and PR. And if you look at places like Cornwall, the marketing and the PR around lower speeds, and particularly 20 miles an hour, is really good. So there's lots and lots of examples around the country as to how we can do this better. So
marketing and PR, you mentioned the COVID regulations and funding that I think are no more. Certainly there's a local example to me where there had been prior concerns about rat running and speeding in a residential area. The COVID regulations and funding was used to do what hadn't been possible before, and an election switched on the basis of actually, it turned out people quite liked it once it was in. Is there some justification for looking at the way regulations can be done on a temporary basis? in areas where there's already a certain amount of popular ask.
Well, interesting.
Have we gone back to overly restrictive regulations in experimenting?
This is a kind of little technical point, actually.
I'm thinking of low traffic neighbourhoods rather than...
But it applies to speed limits too. So, interestingly, so we were involved in the Faversham scheme that Adrian mentioned. And Kent County Council, during COVID, introduced a whole town 20 mile an hour limit using an experimental traffic regulation order. And then they monitored it, and it was popular, and then they made it permanent. Now, some traffic engineers, some highway engineers say and point to very kind of arcane bits of law and say you can't use experimental orders for speed limits. Some people think you can, some people think you can't. There's a kind of a difference of view amongst traffic engineers. I think
we're Parliament, so we make the laws as well.
So I see no reason why you couldn't have experimental speed limits, because I think that would be very valuable. You could then, let's just see how it works and see, let's monitor the journey times. And that was certainly very powerful in Faversham, and then it made it easier. Yeah, it's done in London, it's done in lots of places, but I've heard it said in many cases you can't do that. So clarification would be really helpful on that.
So are experimental schemes part of the solution then? Because I think the general thing that people believe is you make a change which people might not be universally popular, but after 6 months they get used to it. But the problem with the experimental schemes is the campaign against schemes can grow because there's a feeling that there's still a hope that it can be changed or reversed. Well, so we're not better to take that traditional approach where we consult, we have a well-designed scheme, we implement it. We know there's going to be some initial issues, but we get through it.
I think there's...
I'm speaking through experience. I've got scars on my back.
I think there's a value in it, but what you do is you don't make it a referendum. So you say, okay, these are our expected outcomes, this is what we think is going to happen, and we monitor against those. We monitor against the evidence, not against people's opinions. So I think we can do them as long as we do them in a very careful and controlled way. Sorry, Lily.
No, I think, don't forget, we're trying to get to an outcome. Sometimes what we as highways authorities introduce don't work. So actually the benefit of having an experimental scheme is you can make changes.
There's a genuine question, I guess, you're asking.
Yeah. So, and you could get perverse travel outcomes that you didn't actually understand. So actually experimentation can be extremely powerful, and it also allows an ongoing and more mature dialogue with local communities. So I'm very supportive of it. In the local, in the low traffic neighbourhood experiment, actually it's proved to be very helpful in getting better outcomes. So you don't need it universally, but I think it has its role.
And in the Tunbridge example, which was done under the same legislation, actually we removed small bits of one or two roads from the 20, so they put them back to 30, and that was actually helpful.
Can I just step sideways a little bit?
Yeah.
So I completely agree that local experimentation can inform some things, and certainly experimental and exceptional legislation and policy, I'd welcome that, because it's a proportionate response to the urgent level of problem that we have. But I'd just like to bring in the RSIB, or whatever we want to call it, the Road Safety Investigation Branch. Surely if that was a national oversight body, so not investigating individual collisions, but looking at the global background factors, looking at these different schemes and seeing what can be brought back and then nationalised and spread out, that will be a structural, systematic way of approaching this problem. I think the RSIB is absolutely key.
Yeah, and that's come up in other sessions.
I do want to move on. Sorry,
Daniel.
I think the only other thing on Wales I was going to ask was about the effectiveness of the policy where some roads moved back from 20 to 30. I know we've just touched back on that.
It was very few, actually. It was very... I mean, again, the press. Some of the press would have you believe that there was a kind of wholesale reversion. It was really very small. I mean, what's interesting, so there was a range of... we use the term exceptions. So there was the default 20, but you could set exceptions where you saved a 30, as it were. I think the authority with the greatest number of exceptions was in South Wales, was I think it was Blaenau Gwenters. 10% of its network was saved at 30. Wrexham had the fewest, around 2% of the network. Interestingly, Wrexham is the authority that's probably put the most roads back to 30. Okay, but it's still levelling up, so about 50 roads. But across is it 22 local authorities in Wales? The majority have done 5-10 roads, some have done none at all. So it's really been a quite tinkering. So, there's been a little bit of reversion, but really very small, and much less than some, some of the press that you hear.
But that shouldn't be interpreted as failure, should
No,
it? You know, all of those areas where it's been introduced will have been safer for that period where those lower speeds were achieved. Yeah. And if we then find that there are other reasons we want to de-restrict them a bit, then fine. Yep. At the moment, we need to accept that we need to move things to saving people and injuries, and then where we can, in a structured, systematic way, release restrictions where that is possible without increasing risk disproportionately.
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, some people say Wales is a failure because of all the controversy and so on, but it's a massive success. Yes. It's absolutely a massive success.
Saving people and injuries.
Yeah. Right, okay.
And to the Wrexham...
Very quickly, Adrian.
Yes, on the Wrexham point, I mean, they moved 55 roads back to 30. Actually, quite a lot of those should have already been accepted in the first round. And that's actually the point of getting the design right, so you know which road you're going to accept. When you change the majority of roads to 20, know which ones you're going to accept. And that's where the local information comes.
With exceptions and being clear about why the exceptions are.
Indeed.
Okay, Daniel.
So, I need to go shortly, but I'll talk about the greatest part of the world first, of course, London. Lilli, can you talk to us about the rollout of 20-mile-an-hour zones in London and the challenges that you've faced here? What have been the greatest challenges?
Yeah. So again, they're not zones; they're limits. Well, I would say that the local boroughs in London have pioneered this, and that TfL came along. So there were already 20-mile-an-hour limits in large parts of London right back in the late 1980s. So this has been an early adopted policy. And actually, when we looked at our evidence, we were looking right back to that period up into current times. Obviously, with the introduction of 20-mile-an-hour on all of the strategic roads in central London from 2020 on, and then Westminster going to a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit, we now have all of central London and much of inner London all of inner London actually being 20 as well. So there are 11 boroughs in London out of the 33 that don't have at least 75% of their roads being 20-mile-an-hour. That is generally aligned with political alliance, so it does tend to be more of the conservative boroughs that don't have 20-mile-an-hour, and I think that goes back to the conversations we have about the perceptions and attitudes in local areas to these kind of measures. But many of them are working with us, and we are providing evidence as to how they might take forward those measures. So there will, I think, be change in coming years to make sure that we continue to see the benefits. But that is why we've talked about having a stronger national policy on this that really makes it clear that local politicians are making decisions within a context and against an evidence base now, which is unequivocal, that actually reducing speed limits on residential roads will save lives. And as highway authorities, you also have a duty to improve road safety. So as a public servant, you have that duty. So I do think that needs to be brought out and made much clearer that if you can reduce risk, you should be reducing risk on your roads, and we now have the measures that we know will make it happen. And as Transport for London, the other thing that we do is we fund the local boroughs through their transport. So we fund the local boroughs' transport plans, so that money can be made available for 20-mile-an-hour limits to be introduced.
And I was just going to say that duty that he refers to, there are very few duties that highway authorities have. They have a lot of powers, but they don't have so many duties. But reducing casualties is one of them, and perhaps it's time that was given greater emphasis by government.
And I just, you said earlier there's 12 boroughs that still 11 that aren't there in London, and in the main they're going to be the outer boroughs and boroughs like mine, of course. And I think the last 20-mile-an-hour area in my borough that's introduced was about 22 years ago. I was the cabinet member, so it's a long, long time ago. But since then, the world's changed. We've got social media, we've got disinformation, and I'm sure, like me, Chair, you went through that experience of ULEZ, and what that did in outer London boroughs. So what would we learn from that experience, which was full of different levels of information, let's put it that way, in a social media context? To the extent in my borough there was a terrorist incident, as you may well know, over it. So what would we learn from that if we were then looking at trying to persuade that a further role there in some of those areas.
So I'll kick off, but I think others will join in. I mean, I think we have already gone over some of the key lessons for success. I think with you, Les, we got there. But again, if we reflect, maybe we could have done more on the pre-communication as to why those measures are needed and to bring communities with us. There's very high levels of compliance now, and it is delivering enormous benefits to air quality in London. So looking in the rearview mirror, it's much easier to justify it. I think with speed, we are now in a really good position that we have such good evidence from London. We need to help and support, and we are doing this now with post the local elections in London to provide that evidence to all local councillors and say, this is what works, this is how you can discuss it with your local communities, because the demand is there. And with ULEZ too, even though there was a very vocal campaign, that wasn't the majority. That was a minority that made their voices very loud. And we know that most people do comply because we have around 90% compliance levels with ULEZ. We can have similar impacts with speed as well. And it's really making sure that voice in that campaign and that knowing that evidence is there to support local politicians in taking those measures forward.
And I think perhaps as well, and this goes way beyond 20 miles an hour, but actually equipping local politicians to understand the backlash and that it will come, and maybe perhaps learning from those politicians who've been through those difficult experiences, but making them understand that he's not representative. And perhaps what they need to do is just log off Facebook and stop looking at it, because it is not the truth. It is a distortion of reality. I mean, disinformation. It does
you
not.
just have to ask the same people if they want to reopen a closed-off cul-de-sac that was done 40 years ago, and they go, "Oh no, we wouldn't want that."
So speed limits don't go back up. I mean, that's the lesson we can all take away: is that once they come down. I mean, apart from one or two trimmings on experimental, as a rule of thumb, they do not go back up once they've come down and people have got used to it.
And if you set the national assumption at 20, whether you do it legislatively or by values and encouragement, and then have the local authority justify where and how they can move it to 30, you get a completely different question. Yeah. It's a completely different discussion.
Daniel, I'm conscious
I'm going to do one last question.
So
what I would say, us politicians do spend too much time looking on social media, but I think the challenge always is how you convince Mrs Jones, because it's Mrs Jones, when she sees you at the bus stop, that gets convinced of what they're reading.
Indeed.
And the experience from you, as I'm sure you know, this chair, was the level of information out there was wild, quite frankly.
Yeah.
My last question before I go. So there's been a lot of discussion about 20 mile an hour limits. Are there other speed limit interventions that you think could produce equally beneficial effects?
Monitoring and the use of technology. So many modern vehicles integrate computers that monitor and can record speeds and all sorts of other parameters, and we aren't systematically having access to those as part of our monitoring and enforcement structure.
Alex has got some questions on new technology. Thank you. Anyone else?
Oh, yeah, well, I think the biggest one for me is the 60 miles per hour on interurban single carriageway roads. I mean, it's far too high. We know that head-on collisions, which is what you get a lot, and run-off incidents on single carriageway roads, they're not survivable with a combined head-on speed of 120 miles per hour. So I think we have to do that. I mean, Scotland was considering reducing its rural speed limit again. I think has kind of gone by the wayside. But I think for me that's the other one that we really should focus on.
And Surrey County Council is doing some very interesting work on that, on reducing its rural speed. But again, it's constrained by the guidance.
Yep.
If the guidance were more, a bit more liberal, then it would have been able to go even further.
But how do you see? Just going back to London before I go. On the those boundary issues, your kind of example, Chair, I can think of on the Bexley-Dartford boundary. Mm-hmm. You go from 70 to 50 to 40 to 30 to 20 back to 30 within 2 miles, I think.
Okay,
so how do you see that? But working from a London perspective, Lilli, how do we work some of that out under the current rules on the cross boundary issues?
Well, so I mean, I mean, again, I'm not quite sure how to answer that question, actually.
Maybe I could just say that all of that is because the initial speed limit is too high. Yeah. So you're having to justify the lower speed. So I can justify it there, but I can't do it there. Oh, I can do it there.
Yeah, it's also to do with regs and boundaries, which we're going to come on to in terms of who's responsible. You've got to head out. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Daniel. Can I now go to Ollie?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, Adrian, in the written evidence from 20's Plenty for Us, it argued that the strategy is informed by safe system principles but not truly aligned with those principles. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yes, because the human body is not could probably not survive an impact at 30 miles an hour. And yet, I think it's in theme 3, there's a picture of a thank you sign of somebody going 27 miles an hour on what is clearly a residential street. So it needs to just say it's 20 unless you can justify a higher speed limit. So and that's the nub of it.
I don't know whether it's introduced that in evidence so far, but if the committee's heard of the Stockholm Declaration of 2020, I don't know if you know the UN Road Safety Commission in 2020, and Article 11 of that, which was underpinned the Welsh guidance on setting exceptions. And it says to set in European a 30-kilometre speed limit wherever vulnerable road users and vehicles mix in a frequent manner, and that is absolutely core of the safe systems principle when it comes to applying to speed. And I think that is missing, and that it would be very helpful if that was in the strategy, and then that could carry through into the guidance. So it's a fundamental principle that underpins all of the evidence, and it goes back to Rob's point about the survivability of the human body, basically.
Okay.
I agree with those points. I'd just like to make a point about the safe system as a whole, and something I think we don't capture between our organisations and the population. For a system to work, we need to have a really mature understanding and embedding of all its components in a balanced fashion, according to a sort of weighting of how they influence the injuries and deaths that actually occur. And that's rarely done. Often we'll relate to, we've got a safe system because we're thinking about the independent components. But until you marry them up and they're singing in harmony, the whole system isn't as effective. If you put too much emphasis on some of the components at the expense of some other critical ones, and I'd put driver responsibility and speed at the top of those and leadership, then you can put an awful lot of work into those other pillars. You can say, yes, we're a safe system, but it doesn't achieve the outcomes you expect because it's not a mature, embedded, deep system. Yeah, and that kind of parallels something that we've seen across other industries. And in medicine, we had it with risk and risk management maturity models. There are matrices that describe this concept of people are aware of safety. They talk about it a little bit. There's a few sort of segments of it that are done, and then it's completely systematically embedded in our systems. And I think sometimes this really has power across the outcomes that we're seeing, that people are not marrying the whole system up, and therefore the system falls to pieces as far as the effectiveness that we predict.
Just to say that in the danger of not treating it as a system. Well, so in terms of, we really do try to take a systemic approach. So we will prioritise all of our investment decisions by their ability to deliver on reducing the greatest risk, which is how you get that focus. If you don't do that and you just sort of say, we've got elements of a safe system, you can focus on the really nice to haves and the easy to dos, which actually don't have much impact. So you really do need to have a systemic approach which is driving the greatest focus on the greatest change, which is why we've been talking so much and so passionately about speed limits.
Okay, thank you very much. Now over to Alex.
Thank you, Chair. We've covered this to some extent, so you can keep some answers short. Is there a contradiction in the government's approach to reducing those killed and seriously injured on our roads, given that speed management is a key lever for achieving this objective, but it's left to local discretion?
It is a tension. Yes, it is. It's a tension, isn't it? Because is it possible for a national body or a national government to understand the right speed limit on every road and street across the country? I think there has to be a role for local decision making and local knowledge. So I think and we are living in a world and a government that's probably pushing even further down the devolution role. So I think the idea that we're going to have we would take it completely out of the hands of local authorities to set speed limits on their roads. I'm not sure that's practicable. However, I think we can set a framework for in which those decisions are taken that is much more controlled and much more accountable. Because I think at the moment, if a local politician decides, and actually, I mentioned the road safety concern. There was a very impassioned ex-councillor who just lost his seat. I think it was in Felixstowe, had achieved a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit in the town, so it was all ready set to go. Elections happened, new individual came in, new portfolio holder, and just scrapped the lot. So, and there is no consequence on that individual for taking that decision. And I think we need to set up a system, and we're talking about systemic, we need to set up a system of checks and balances and accountability. So what would be the impact? What would that politician have to do to justify that decision? Let's make it more explicit. Yes, I will sign this piece of paper in this committee report that says I'm going to set the speed limit 10 miles an hour higher than the national guidance set, and I am signing off that it will cause 5 more casualties a year. I'm putting my name to
there is the ballot box, I suppose.
Well, there is the ballot box, but I do think that's a very weak, very, very weak check and balance. I do. I think it needs to be much more explicit and much more in black and white accountability, and then the public attitude and those people who do care passionately will hold that, will see the evidence. What do you mean? You have signed off this piece of paper, and in the full knowledge that this is leading to a greater degree of road casualties. So I think we can change this. I think we can keep the local decision making, but I think we need to think about the system and the way in which perhaps use things like the local outcomes framework. So the government is setting a local outcomes framework, every local authority to have targets and to meet it in terms of casual KSIs per billion vehicle kilometres. Let's make those metrics front and centre in the decisions that politicians take at local level. And I think, yeah.
Two brief points. I think we've covered a lot of this already, so I won't repeat that. As far as the ballot box, removes these decisions from popularity contests and concerns about ongoing sort of votes and things. But it's about the leadership and coordination and the accountability and the governance structures we put around it. It can be local or it can be central, as long as we've got the correct governance mechanisms and accountability for the outcomes, the deaths and injuries, then it doesn't matter how we do it. There's a number of ways of skinning the same cat.
And then obviously Wales as a country is a reasonably large geographical area. The equivalent in terms of like square miles in my part of the world would be the whole of the east of England. Yet these decisions are being taken by individual local transport authorities, highways authorities actually. Is there a sense of how big a geography such a decision sort of needs to be taken over for it to be unconfusing to the driver?
Yeah, but Wales didn't do. But again, this is a misunderstanding. The Welsh government did not set the speed limits across Wales. It didn't do that. It just changed the national default. At this moment in time, from streetlights mean 30 to now streetlights mean 20. Local authorities across Wales, local highway authorities across Wales, are still completely empowered to change the speed limit on any road in their area. So there was no central decision making. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of what happened in Wales. It was simply changing the national default. So they had, if they sat on their hands and did nothing, the speed limit would come down to 20. So it's not quite the same thing. So in the east of England, now a few years ago, Birmingham lobbied the government for similar powers to Wales to change the default speed limit of street lighting in the West Midlands or in Birmingham. So in street lights in Birmingham would mean 20 and in Sandwell they would mean 30. I don't think that's feasible. I don't think that's possible. I think it could be changed across the whole of England and we could do that. But I think, if you had a region of England, it was difficult enough for one nation within the United Kingdom to do it. And there was talk at the time of signs on the boundaries, kind of European-style signs of you're now entering this nation, and in towns and villages we drive like this. That wasn't done, but I think it's acceptable at that scale. But to have a region or a city where the default speed limit is this, without any signs to tell drivers, I don't think that's feasible.
Okay, if there's time at the end, we'll do that 13. Okay, thank you. So now we go on to Scott and road design.
I'm keen to understand to what extent road design has an impact on the speed that drivers use the road on. And I think it's maybe worth thinking about, existing roads and also how good we are at getting new developments in a place where speed is in a good place as well. Lilli.
Yeah, so I think road design is critical to how drivers interpret and use the road, and also the choices that are available to other road users to decide whether they feel safe using it. It was traditionally a bit of a block on the introduction of 20 miles an hour because traditionally the police would be hesitant. They would sort of say, if the road doesn't look and feel like a 20, undefined, we won't enforce on it. And I think certainly in London we've moved beyond that conversation, but equally to elicit the right psychological response from drivers, the more you can use the reduced limits to build out sidewalks and to provide more facilities for walking and cycling, or even just to do more tree planting, you will get a better response in terms of compliance. So I don't think of 20 mile an hour as an end in itself. It's really not. It's about creating a healthy street environment that unlocks the kind of activity we want to see in town centres, and that's economic activity as well as people travelling actively.
And the ideal design structure would segregate pedestrians and other road users from vehicles, wouldn't they? And separate vehicles in different directions. But Britain doesn't really lend itself to that geographically.
I don't do we really want that? I don't really like that road design.
There are different opinions, obviously. I think roads engineering can be quite critical in hotspots, where we find that there are recurrent problems, understanding what we can do to change the road design to prevent future incidents. But in the previous session it was mentioned there's 192,000 miles of roads, and the cost and delays in managing all that is just, makes it an impossible task, doesn't it?
I mean, I think we obviously know how we can design roads that reduce speeds. There's this kind of traditional traffic calming, but I think what we're learning is that actually the more subtle changes, cheaper changes, we can make a difference. So I think traffic engineers historically have kind of assumed a design speed, and thinking of it through the needs of the motor vehicle, they've said, well, we must engineer the road for drivers to be able to travel at that speed. And I think we need to then say, and often that speed in urban areas has been, well, if you look at the design manual for roads and bridges, actually says we should design our urban roads for 60 kilometres an hour, which is 37 miles an hour, just in case drivers want to go a little bit quicker. So we have a problem. So if you look at which is the kind of, the central tenet of many highway engineers, the DMRB is actually sending completely the wrong signal. So we need to be much clearer and say the design speed is now 30 kilometres an hour. And we engineer our roads to achieve that. But that's going to take obviously a long time. But there's many low-cost changes you can make in the short term. Well, so narrower traffic lanes. We have a standard traffic lane in this country that is oddly 3.65 metres, which is just a metrication of 12 feet. And many highway engineers believe there's something magic about the 12-foot lane. We know from lots of evidence that narrower lanes carry just as much traffic and are much safer and will lead to slower speed. So narrower traffic lanes would be one good thing. Then you can make more space for walking and cycling and all the rest of it. But even things like removing the centre line, very simple things. It actually, if you resurface the road and don't put the centre line back, that will actually reduce speeds by 1 or 2 miles per hour. And and it's cheaper. And people think it's less safe. Oh, cry! I need this. Well, actually, no. Because drivers react to the environment. If there's no centre line that doesn't give them quite that much certainty, they react by slowing down a little bit. So lots of kind of little psychological clues.
Making the turns tighter is absolutely critical.
Junctions.
Well, no, just so you have to turn hard. Sweeping turns are incredibly dangerous. So a very high number, I think it's around 50% of pedestrian serious injuries in London are people turning into side roads. And so we are tightening those turns up because it requires you to slow down to make the turn, and you're also more visible. So these aren't massively expensive design changes.
Is that in consultation with the fleet managers of large vehicles? Will they still be able to get around
they'll
these
still be able
rules?
to. Yeah. You still need to make sure that the road width or the turn is able for that. I mean, in terms of heavy goods vehicles or service vehicles. Yes, but
buses, of course.
Of course, yeah.
There probably are opportunities, though, aren't there? Wherever a new road scheme or a new road is being built or something's being maintained, are we applying what road engineers know that will achieve the outcomes we need? I don't know the answer to that question, but that's a very valid.
We're moving away from.
So with new roads, are we getting them right?
No. I mean, so there's a document called Manual for Streets, which some of you will know.
Which has been raised by previous witnesses in previous sessions.
I was involved with the first edition, and the new Manual for Streets, which some people call Manual for Streets 3, has been promised since 2019, and the government is just. I mean, it's good to see all these documents, the road safety strategy, Better Connected, all of these things are promising the new Manual for Streets, but we so desperately need it. We know that, and there's been so much learning since the first edition came out. It's
some previous witnesses have said that it's now in contradiction to current strategy on the road safety strategy. So, yeah.
There's a chance then that this new manual for streets, it could give better design as a design for speed, lower speeds.
Absolutely, it should be front and centre. And actually, I mean, I would say this, wouldn't I? But the first manual for streets, I think it's pretty good when it comes to designing down for speed. But I think we've learnt much more. We could go further. Yeah.
Okay, Ollie.
Yes, it kind of follows on from the last question, really. To what extent is fear of traffic among pedestrians, cyclists and other more vulnerable road users influenced by high speeds in cars? What does the evidence say on that?
Well, we do an awful lot of interviews and understanding of behaviour in London of people who potentially would cycle or are walking. It's the main fear of traffic is the main, so it's volume and speed is the main barrier to people walking and cycling. It's particularly the main barrier to allowing children to walk or cycle to school. And we know when we've introduced, or local authorities have introduced measures such as low traffic neighbourhoods, which either temporarily or permanently remove traffic, that you get very large uplifts in people walking and cycling and also safety outcomes.
And sorry, I don't know if you. Sorry, Adrian. It particularly impacts on women, doesn't it? I think there's evidence of that. Is that disproportionately women are more fearful of, particularly when it comes to cycling, more fearful. And we know we have currently if you even study in London, it's probably about 2-to-1 ratio of male to female people cycling. And if we are going to get the uptake in cycling that the government policy, when we have to get more women cycling, we have to do something around the fear of traffic.
And that all links into mental health and that agenda as well.
Yeah. So coming back to the discussion around the previous question, then, so logic. Well, tell me if I'm misunderstanding. That logic would therefore mean, given that is one of the main barriers, you either have to significantly reduce speeds on roads consistently, or you have to provide dedicated infrastructure.
So we. Yes and yes, but obviously if you're the Strategic Transport Authority of London, it's clear that the roads also have to function for volumes of traffic, and still 50% of journeys are made by car in London, and there's an enormous amount of vehicle traffic as well to service the city. So they're in designing streets to make them safer. There is a clear set of guidance and advice that we've developed for our own network and for the boroughs. It helps them identify that on strategic roads, or roads where the volumes of traffic are higher, you do need to have segregated and safe, where you do physically need to segregate cyclists or pedestrians from moving traffic. But on residential roads where speeds can be kept to 20 and are lower, there's lower traffic volumes, you can mix traffic, you can safely, and so that is a very clear hierarchy of how you need to manage and physically change the road network, dependent on speed and volume, and it doesn't mean that in every case everything needs to be segregated.
No, indeed.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to test the chair's patience here. For all Transport for London is quite eager to boast about what it has achieved on this. I mean, I'd perhaps gently suggest, compared to comparable Dutch cities, there is a long way to go.
There's a long way to go,
and certainly in terms of as someone who goes across this every day, the traffic light programming at Hyde Park Corner definitely does not seem to support the vast numbers of pedestrians and cyclists.
You
go across that. The wait times are unbelievable.
Yeah.
So I think perhaps if I make sure I understood what you were saying in the previous discussion, Rob, about how hard it would be to change these things in terms of road design or whatever. I mean, the Netherlands is more densely populated than we have. Only one of their cities was destroyed in World War II, and yet they have been able to do this. And they've also provided for road traffic. They have the most dense motorway network in Europe. So it's not either or. It's the right tool for the job, I would suggest. So how can we? What do you think are the? We'll turn this into a question. What do you think are the policy levers that need to be pulled nationally or for devolved administration so we can move further in terms to address this fear of traffic that is the main barrier to walking and cycling uptake?
So just taking that, I think. So if we go back to the government's road safety strategy, it had lots and lots of good components, but I think it is lacking the commitment to actually making change, and the pace at which those measures need to be introduced, and the clarity that they are committed to certain goals such as eliminating death and injury. So the Netherlands have been pursuing very positive policies in terms of promoting cycling for a lot longer than we have here. So you need consistency of policy, you need consistency of investment, and you need very strong policy direction from a national level to support that local direction. And that will drive through some of the inconsistencies and the sluggishness that you see both in London and elsewhere.
Do you feel we are getting that clear policy determination from the national level?
So I think the strategy is definitely a step forward, but I would really hope that we see less consultation and more action. So we need to actually move through to delivery.
Yeah. I think that's a wonderful note on which to move on to the next question, Chair.
Right, we're back. Okay, and now to new technologies. Alex.
Thank you. What role should intelligent speed assistance play in helping drivers to comply with speed limits?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We should embrace the new technologies, and particularly things like the absolute limit. It should be physically impossible, technologically impossible for a vehicle to exceed a legal speed limit on the roads. We have the technical capability, we have the infrastructure, and where there are glitches, they can be ironed out. That will be a starting point, and I think, as mentioned,
should that be down to the private sector to do that?
No, it could be down to so for example, it's required on all new buses in London, and we're retrofitting all our buses. So 3,000 of the 9,000 buses in London have what we call ISA. That's mandatory ISA, you can't override it. So we're a public body, and we're doing it. We also require that in our own vehicle fleet. It could be a national requirement.
Yes.
So
for vehicles.
Absolutely, and the government is consulting on that, which is great. But we need them to take the step of. I mean, it's likely that vehicle manufacturers, because they're required to do it for the EU. So because Northern Ireland is in the single market, if you hire a car in Northern Ireland, it will come with ISA. And so it is already happening in parts of the UK. But we need to bring it in. It will probably come in with manufacturers, but I think the government needs to be much more kind of positive about it. And I think as well, it's not perfect at the moment. In my car has it, but I have to choose to turn it on, which I do most of the time. But it's not always reliable in detecting the speed limit. So I think there is a credibility problem. The government has to go hand in hand with making digital speed limits available, so that the in-car systems can read them, so you get that consistency. Because if it comes in every new vehicle, but it doesn't work very well, then the credibility, and there'll be again a kind of pushback against it. So. But for me, it has great potential. One of the arguments against lower speed limits is always the enforcement argument, and over time, ISA removes that as a reason not to do it.
But only proper ISA that is absolutely compulsory and mandatory, and you can't override it. At the moment, the ISA that is legislated for, I understand, is not absolutely compulsory, and you can turn it off, and it doesn't absolutely adhere to the speed limits on the road. So I think we ought to be careful about what we're talking about.
Okay. When you've got a speedometer in front of you, the middle is sort of around 60, the bit that you look at as a driver. And there's a whole load of speeds that you're obviously not allowed to do on that side.
Can't do.
Should it be moved, that middle point?
I think that's a really interesting idea.
Well, I think it's completely bizarre that. Sorry, this is not my specialist subject, but I think it's completely bizarre that any car is allowed to be sold which can do more than 70. I mean, it's just really, really weird.
Yeah.
I agree.
Sorry, yes, carry on, Alex. Yeah.
On to 17, or?
Yeah. Fine. Yeah.
Do you think that the strategy in any way overstates the potential impact of new technologies?
No, I don't think so. I think it's there. I mean, I think to some extent, I feel it's a little kind of too lukewarm on them. It points to the advantages, but doesn't really.
I don't think it embraces enough the monitoring and behavioural change that could come from continuous data monitoring and dashcam footage. So one of the things that we know from serious collision investigators is that even after a fatality or a serious injury, they do not have access reliably and early to the data that onboard computers and mobile devices that people are carrying have, because there's all sorts of blockages from companies saying, oh no, that's the car owner's data and we have to have their permission to release it. And it's not uncommon for serious collision investigators to have the option of having to pay £4,000 to have access to that data. And it comes 6 months later, reams of data that are uninterpretable without the expert knowledge of the motor manufacturer. That's just a very simple example. Why don't we align legislation so that it has to be immediately released in a meaningful manner for those instances where there's been a death or serious injury? And why don't we extend it to a requirement for the benefits of accessing vehicle use to have a continuous telematics and dashcam footage that is recording all the time and is then reviewed, and the hour before reviewed by investigating authorities, so that we understand what part behaviour and the way that car is being driven in the lead up to the incident happens. Because at the moment, the event recorders only capture 5 seconds of data, and that's really prior to an impact or incident. That only really captures the engineering components. It totally misses the driver behaviour choices and all the other things. And I know there are issues around accuracy, precision, particularly if you're thinking about prosecution, but we're not necessarily thinking about that. We're thinking about if you had a visual record, a dashcam record of what actually happened, you can immediately understand what happened and then build your evidence around the appropriate sort of bits of information that are from that. And shouting to police serious collision investigation, that's a real frustration of theirs, that there's that blockage and that lack of access to information. I'd extend it. And can I just highlight new and novice drivers? Because 6% of licence holders are new and novice drivers, younger drivers, and we know that in the first year, 18% of them have a collision. They represent 24% of the killed and seriously injured. They're killing themselves, they're killing other people. Why don't we start, if we're a bit nervous about introducing widespread telematics and dash cams to everyone, which is what my preference would be, but I know that's seen as extreme. Why don't we at least start with saying every new driver has to have it for the first 5 years of their journey? Because that would change their behaviour because they know they're being monitored. It would give us the evidence from this excess, disproportionate amount of collisions that we can then focus the RSIB or investigators on understanding what's actually happening and capture all these human elements.
On the disjoint between speed limits changing on the road, which presumably is the one the driver has to comply with, and the data coming in real time in their car. So the number of times I've driven on a road that I can see from the repeaters or on the road that it's a 20, but my, in my case, Google Maps, but whatever technology I'm using, says that it's still 30. Why is there a disjoint? And surely that's pretty important if we are to bring that use of telematics into much more actively.
No, that was the point I was referring to. I think there is a credibility problem at the moment. They are not accurate enough. And
why is that, and what needs to happen?
Because nobody's prioritised it and said this is how we're going to run this system.
But who's responsible for making sure that what comes through on the sat nav, whatever you call it, the generic name is for that now, and the actual speed limit, because you've got a legal process to change the speed limit. Shouldn't that immediately switch the data over?
There should be a national digital speed map, which there's not, as far as I understand. No. So we have created one in London, but it's which is available on the website. Yes, and but it requires. It is because speed limits change street by street due to traffic and
regulation orders.
Regulation orders. We then have to monitor every single TRO and make sure that we then update the map. So that's how it's sort of done with, isn't it?
That disjoint also happens in terms of road closures and lane closures and so on.
But again, perfectly fit for a national view on this and a streamlining of process.
It's not rocket science.
It's not. This could be digitised and made so much more straightforward.
I mean, the TRO process, the government was consulting, many years ago about or considering how to streamline, improve, bring up to date. It's an analogue process. It's very paper based. It's very, very clunky advertising in the London Gazette. All of this.
Yeah.
So we have to bring that into the 21st century. I think it is. Just on that digital, it is astonishing that I can't go onto the web and see what is the speed limit in this part of the UK. I mean, it's just astonishing. The Ordnance Survey have a map of speeds and speed limits, but you have to pay for it. Yeah, I mean, it is astonishing, really. So, yeah, there is a gap there, and it has to be government to plug that gap.
Okay, and sorry, you touched on EU vehicle safety standards. Should the UK adopt the current EU vehicle safety standards?
Yes. And I mean, the direction seems to be, that's the indication. And I think many manufacturers are would find it difficult to make a special UK car. It's in their interest to bring it in, but it would just make it, again, much simpler and more acceptable to the public if this is in conformity with regulation.
Okay, thank you. Alex, quick question. Did you want to do 13?
Yeah, okay. Does the Department for Transport collect the right data to best understand driver compliance with speed limits?
It's pretty clunky at the moment.
No.
What should it do then?
Well, it should use in-car data, the connected vehicle data, which is available, and use that. It doesn't need these speed tubes down in various random places, it's just giving a completely every time these free flow speeds come out, we have to then explain to our people we talk to that actually they're not very relevant because they're in specific places. And the connected vehicle data now is so good that actually we just don't need to do this free flow speed analysis. We can get it from the connected vehicle data.
Yeah.
My understanding is that it's based on 77 automatic vehicle camera type sort of setups across the country. That's a fairly temporary small picture of the whole. So completely agreed, and the data is there within vehicles at the moment.
And for 20 mile an hour places, it's only 7.
Yeah,
and most of those. They're atypical of 20 mile an hour places. They just happen to be where they've got those speed tubes, and at some point in time the speed limit's changed from 30 to 20, so we can monitor them at 20 now.
Yeah.
But we need a deeper understanding of the actual speeds and the range of speeds, so it's not just speed limits and proportions, is it? It's the actual shape of the curve.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, in preparation I went on the website to have a look at the data on compliance, and the government has acknowledged that they for the 2025 they're no longer collecting data on the old basis. That I think there's an acceptance by the department that the system they were using, which as Adrian was saying, 7 in 20 and 78 sites for the whole of Great Britain to monitor speed. I mean, really insufficient. Interesting. So Transport for Wales, its monitoring of the 20 mile an hour speed limit in Wales is using in-car GPS data as part of its assessment. So again, Wales is kind of moving on a little bit there.
Right, okay. If there's no further questions, I'm going to come to the final question. So, naturally, we've heard from many families and people who suffered a loss because of avoidable collisions. So, looking specifically at speed, what is the single most important recommendation this committee could make to strengthen the government's road safety strategy? I'll start with Rod and work that way.
The RSIB launched and appropriately focused at action interventions to specifically look at driver responsibilities and awareness about the influence that their choices around speed have on the risk to others and the public engagement and awareness piece.
Lilli, I think that was 2 or 3.
No. RSIB 1.
No, I mean, I think back to making the policy on 20 mile an hour clear and default in urban areas would be probably the most important thing that they need to lead on. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
And I would say make speed limits fit what I've said here, the function, the uses and the characteristics of the road, not the existing speed. So too much of our speed limits are set based on what drivers want to travel at, the old 85th percentile, and it leads to this nonsense of 24 miles per hour being the barrier. Once you make the decision that the speed limit should follow the function of the road and who's using it, then immediately 20 miles per hour becomes the speed limit where there are people. Back to my Stockholm Declaration, and then everything flows from that.
Okay.
Can you guess what I'm going to say? So it's 20 miles an hour at a national level, either legislatively defined or with very, very strict guidance about how you implement it at local authority level.
Okay. One point. What would be the disadvantage of not doing it nationally by local authority area? If by going for local authority area, would it be about clutter and confusion for drivers or what?
No, if anything, so that if you went the Wales approach, which is we change what streetlights mean. So streetlights mean 20, they don't mean 30, and therefore...
As you're moving from one local authority area to another?
Well, that will, by its nature, that will iron out the differences because street lighting is there. So most 30-mile-per-hour roads do not have a speed limit put on them by the local authority.
They have a default 30?
They have a default 30 because of the street lighting. So if you change
if that road passed from one local authority which had one policy into another authority that had another default policy, how would that be managed?
Well, it would, so if authority A and authority B neither have a speed limit that they've set, so the street lighting, the speed limit is 30 by default for street lighting, you change the national law, they immediately become 20 on both. But then it would mean that local authority would then have to take a conscious decision to raise the speed limit back up. I think that's
signs on.
And that's a more difficult.
Let me ask the question. Sorry, I'm obviously not being very clear. The road safety strategy is delegating to local authorities if they want to change the default speed limit in their areas, is my understanding. Or it's just on specific roads as it is in London.
It depends what you mean by default. Is it a legal default or a policy default?
Oh.
Yeah, so at the moment there's no intention in the road safety strategy to change the legal default.
No, that's correct.
So ideally that would be what we would do. And I think if you did that, then you would iron out most of the differences. If you leave it as it is, and the government sets a clear policy default of 20, which is what we have in Scotland, it won't eliminate the possibility of differences at the boundary. But if you bring in much greater checks and balances, things like a requirement to sign off, as I suggested, some kind of sign off, I think you place a greater burden and a greater degree of difficulty to not comply with the clear guidance that's written. So I think that's probably...
You think the way the road safety strategy is worded at the moment gives the right sense of direction,
well, it's not really...
but isn't as good, but because, okay, what I'm trying to get at, the government isn't going for a default. They're going for local area by local area. And what do you see as the specific problems with that? Given, as we know from Daniel's examples from South East London, that different local authorities have very different attitudes, therefore are going to implement this policy.
Very quickly. So they're committed to new guidance. That's fine. Tick in the box for new guidance. What it doesn't say is that guidance is going to be really strong and strong enough to eliminate, as far as we possibly can, those boundary difficulties.
Yeah, and I think if it's not clear that the expectation I think what it should really set out nationally, the evidence would suggest that the expectation is that it's 20, and therefore, if you're not implementing that, you have to justify why that's acceptable in safety terms. Now, if I was using the analogy of the railway, which I also look after, if you have to reduce risk as low as reasonably practical. If you're not doing that, then you have to have, if you're not doing it through one measure, then you have to have other mitigations. Yeah. So they need to demonstrate why that road is safe, even though the speed limit wasn't the safest one we know it is. And I think it creates a dialogue which just doesn't exist at the moment, because people can abdicate from making decisions on it because the default currently is 30.
The risk is distraction and inefficiency, isn't it? And as a driver, inconsistencies and then confusion.
That's what I'm trying to get at. Because this isn't being consulted on. This is the strategy.
Yeah.
And so it's quite clear that at the moment the government isn't likely to move away from that, isn't going to move towards what you are all asking for, which is default 20 in urban areas. So, that's what I'm trying to ask is, given that this is the government policy, the practical difficulties of the way they've worded it, rather than what you're saying.
So get the RSIB launched, and they can focus on this and manage that so that it's consistently applied in the best way possible.
I think if the guidance is sufficiently clear that this is what we're expecting you to do, 20, and then...
Guidance isn't there.
No,
they're committed to it. They're committed to it. They are committed to it.
They're going to do guidance.
Yeah, they're going to,
so that's committed.
And
the second commitment is to a safe system. And you cannot have a safe system without 20 as a default, in policy terms, even if not legislatively.
It's a contradiction. Okay. Yeah. Right. Thank you very much for your evidence and the time you spent preparing to come to us today. If there's anything you think you didn't get a chance to cover or cover in a way, in sufficient detail, please do feel free to write to us. We're going to resume our oral evidence sessions in the autumn in this inquiry, but for now, that concludes today's meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Order.